I had a colleague who was doing research on difference between men's and women's education levels within a household. He comes to me and he says, there is a large number of women in recent years who have more education than their husbands. And I said, no, that can't be. Turned out he was right. In 1970s and 80s, you had about 5% of the women who had more education than their husbands. Today, you have close to 28%.
Just to repeat, 28% women have more education than their husbands.
That really surprised us. And I said, okay, so what is going on here? What's happening in this household? What's the implication of this higher education?
Some noises get made with regard to that if all the data sets get connected, right? There could be privacy issues. There could be distrust issues that could be coming through. Is it a genuine concern, or do you think that can be managed? It's only a messaging issue when we are undertaking something of this magnitude.
It's very interesting. We care about privacy and we want to make sure that individual privacy is maintained. But we can think about how to sort of protect it at the same time, sort of connect the data sets. Okay, so there are some creative ideas can be undertaken. Second part of it is that actually US has some very interesting restricted data set centers where you actually can ask the questions and get the answer, but you will never get to see the raw data.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, so one could look at some of that as well. And that said, I actually think that we also have serious privacy issues as it stands. I remember at one point in time doing fieldwork in a Himachal village, and I'm walking by the street and there is this little board on a house. This house was built as a part of the BPL housing program under Indira Awas Yojana. Poor child who lives there. Everybody walking by knows that, this person is sort of a BPL coming from a BPL household. So, I think we might need to think about it more than for the data architecture. But yes, I suspect we can come up with some good balance.
So I want to comment on privacy, just to your point, which is, it is an issue we have to always pay attention to, but it is not an issue that would stop us in our tracks. So I completely disagree where people say it's a privacy issue, just don't do anything. That makes no sense at all, because there are so many good things you can do. So I think we have to do it with a little bit of thought, so that it doesn't put some people in danger. But we can actually do many things like data sets, like that, like analysis without going to individual households, etc. So there is such a wide range that to put a complete stop to it makes no sense. Now I'll give you the reverse of it. For example, with the data that exists today in government databases, we have 50 schemes of the government for anything. Right, you're probably eligible for 3 schemes, Sonal. I don't even know what they are, but I'm sure you're eligible for something that you have no idea. You have no idea about, right? So, and lots of people don't know what schemes they're eligible for. And now you can get to the point where with very little linkage of the database, I can come to a household in a village and say, you are eligible for these 20 schemes. You want to apply for them. You didn't know that you were, but you are. And we're going to help you get all that money directly, and you don't have to pay anything for it. There is no reason why the government itself can do it as opposed to having an agent do it, because much of that data is linked. It's not that difficult to figure out to do it. Now, of course, there is some privacy issues, because how did you know I was eligible and all of that, right? But the value to the person of now all of a sudden I can pay, you're eligible for these scholarships for your kids. You are not getting these 3 payments that you should be getting is worth so much to them that to not try to do that by saying, I don't want to collect any data on you. So I think there'll be lots of cases where we have to strike a reasonable balance. And in my view, given the problems we're trying to solve, I think by and large we've solved the issue of poverty, but we're only getting them here, and we need to get everyone a lot higher. There's so much to do that I think on some of these things we have to just take a practical look and say, what can we do to help improve it? So, there was an issue of privacy before I could send direct benefits transfer to your account. Okay. But today, a huge amount of direct benefits transfer is going to your account. right?
That said, though, I'm a little cautious on the privacy portion of it. So let's get a little careful about it, but being careful, and we should have a national conversation about it that is not ideological. Okay? And think through what can be revealed, what cannot be revealed, how can we do it, protecting maximum amount of privacy. I guess
that's fascinating. That's fascinating. I mean, clearly out of this conversation, the three things come out. One is ability to collect data is much more efficient now, and it will also we can increase the frequency of collection of that data. Second one is use of data, not just for the policy, for action, for the decision making on the ground, and we can use technology to do that. And the third one is broad conversation about that privacy issues notwithstanding, the benefit that it will accrue to the country, to the society, is much more than probably the issues that we are worried about. But that's where I think the civil society and the government have to work together to build an architecture around that. Just kind of switching gears, do we have enough capacity in the country today to do all what we are wanting to do? And Adil, coming to your point, I read your interesting op-ed in Indian Express with regard to how we need to augment the capacity of statisticians vis-a-vis, let's say, we have other institutions that we have. Would you want to just throw some light on that? Because without capacity,
I'll say something and then you should comment on. I can't talk about capacity at every level of this question.
Sure.
Right? Because it's different at every level of the question. But, my view is, one of the good things about India is, people are very entrepreneurial. And if they think there's something that they should know or learn, they do it very fast. Okay? So, people are learning AI at a speed that you can't imagine. In Andhra Pradesh, Chandrababu Naidu has said that every 8th grade kid will get a course in AI. He's made a course in AI available to every citizen of the state for free. You can take a 1-hour course or a 16-hour course or whatever you want, and it's free. And people are taking it in droves. So if you look at the number of Chat GPT subscriptions worldwide, they are roughly 1 billion, I think, right? 1 billion or something, out of which 180 million are in India. Okay, the same thing is happening in Claude and Perplexity. Of course, it helps that if you have a 5G connection on Geo, you get Gemini for free, right? And Perplexity has. But what I mean is that the great advantage we have, since we are not building models of our own, is that people are picking this up very fast. And whether or not you do anything about capacity building, that capacity is being built. And the question is, how do you use it, right? The people are using it for all sorts of other things. So do we need to augment the capacity? Absolutely. But, if we approach this in the usual capacity building way, so we have a 5-year plan of how many people we want to do capacity building on, we're already behind the curve, because this is going to change every month, every quarter, every year. So we need a capacity building approach that allows people to learn very, very fast and as quickly as possible to when it's available. So yes, do we have enough capacity in this? Of course not. At what point would you define that we have enough capacity? I'd say every citizen is a semi-expert on AI, then you have capacity, right? But so we are nowhere close to that. So yes, on every element of data which is so critical, from the collection to the quality to the analytics to the usage, we have to fundamentally improve capacity by a factor of 10. Otherwise, we will not be able to do better than everyone else. Sorry, yours.
But at the same time, I think that there is also a little bit of an elite bias in some of these conversations that we have, right? Can you use ChatGPT or Claude or something and get an answer? Certainly you can. Okay. What is the underlying data on which they are generating these answers is a good question. The data that they often look at, comes from sort of newspapers, many other sources, which are sort of very elite driven in some ways, right? So I remember at one point in time, we were collecting data and we put out some statistics on what percentage of Indian households had couples who had a love marriage as opposed to an arranged marriage, right? And the next question I get is from especially some of the foreign presses was, but can you tell me what percentage are using Tinder? Okay, and frankly, the numbers are really tiny. So this time when we went into the field, we asked, have you heard of matrimonial agencies? Because we didn't quite want to ask about Tinder, okay, but we didn't want to ask whether you had heard of online matrimonial, Shadi.com type of a thing, right? And people had heard about it. How many people had used it? Very tiny fragment. Okay, same way. As elites, we think that everybody has at least some household help to cook and clean. And you actually go out and collect statistics on it, 3% of the households, okay, actually have any household help. So in some sense, we should also have some sort of a reality check on the sense of optimism of the data that is being generated out of these.
So how much of your data is on in the public field?
All our data is in public domain.
Okay. So then all I have to do is to go and ask each of the models that's out there to go look at your household survey data as opposed to other data, right? Mm-hmm. Then that might help.
Absolutely. In fact, I was just thinking, Sonal, just kind of thinking through this about from an NCR perspective, right? Just taking cue from what Adil has said. If we have to make our data more, let's say, democratically available, make it more user-friendly, so that not just the students, but even practitioners, the decision makers can start to use that. Maybe we need to think through of making those tools available.
No, right? That's what I said. You have to do it. The other idea is, actually, when you said newspapers, I thought about it, which was a really interesting idea for you, is to basically make a tool available that's so easy that 5,000 reporters use it. Because then they will get real data as opposed to pseudo data.
I think that's a fantastic idea, because we have actually run training for some of the newspaper journalists at times who actually go out and do their own data analysis. But there are, they can be counted on a finger.
But no, you have to make it simple.
Right. Yeah.
You have to make it
simple. Yeah. I think this is an interesting challenge that's just emerging, and clearly that's going to be the next frontier for us at NCER to think through. How do we make our data more easily available?
So I would put it the other way, which is when you talked about elitist. So NCAER is the most elitist, because only people who understand, Python code or SPSS can even talk to you guys. So your job is to become unelite, right? Or whatever is the opposite of elite. I don't know kya hai. Democratize this so that everybody has access to. That is what I was coming to, right? Because right now it's a little bit of, a set of people who have learned something in a lot of detail. Now we want to make it available so that everybody uses, because I think the data is so good that it can be used for so many things. In any of the ministries that I've worked in, I could see how this could be used for all sorts of things. But the difficulty of doing it for them is very high unless they can learn. And, journalists, some journalists do a lot of research, but a lot of journalists don't do research. They want a quick answer, right? So if you can give them
they are on a red line, they don't have much of a choice.
And that will also then remove the challenge that we were discussing earlier of removing distrust in that data. Because if it is coming from actual data source through a trusted tool, then the lack of trust or having distrust on data then also kind of goes away. Out of this conversation, a few things came out that, data is everything and data is what leads to action. What are the instances when data really surprised you? That you never thought, oh my God, this can't be true. But the data did tell you. Because one of the challenges that will happen is when you give tools to people and they just use the tool, and then out comes an analysis which could be different than what the conventional thinking has been. And that's how the data is. Any interesting?
Well, let me tell you two instances. The first one was actually, I had a colleague who was doing research on difference between men's and women's education levels within a household. Okay, and he comes to me and he says, there is a large number of women in recent years who have more education than their husbands. And I said, no, that can't be. Okay, I grew up in a generation where I had cousins who would actually not finish their college degrees because their husbands had dropped out of college. Right? And so I said, this just can't be. Okay, and then I went and did this programming myself because I had thought he had made a mistake. Turned out he was right. Okay, so
that's what the data said?
Yes, so in 1970s and 80s, you had about 5% of the women who had more education than their husbands. Today, you have close to 28%.
Is that right? Wow.
And
just to repeat, 28% women have more education than their husbands.
of the recent marriage cohorts.
Absolutely. Wow.
And that really surprised us. And I said, okay, so what is going on here? What's happening in this household? What's the implication of this higher education, right? And what you find is one of the most interesting thing is one reason why this higher education is often welcomed in the family, instead of seeing this woman as this uppity woman who might actually destabilize the household, is that she will supervise children's education. She'll not only look after her own children, she'll also look after her brother-in-law's children, okay, and make sure that they get educated. So that it tells you actually there is this enormous human capital within our Indian households, which is not being particularly used in the labor market, but it is being used in some of the household and domestic management. It's quite interesting. The second part actually, which has a tremendous implication for national public policy, okay, is that we have consistently found, looking at national sample survey, that poverty rate is declining, okay, and that is fine. The question is that as we start looking at some of the panel data and look at specific households, what's happening to them in early 2000s, mid 2011, 12, 2022, what you start realizing is that while the poverty rate is declining, some people get out of poverty and some people fall into poverty. Okay, so the population of people who is poor doesn't remain stable. And it has a real impact for our national policy, because all of our safety net programs were designed with the idea that we will identify people who are poor, we will give them BPL card, they will go on for 10 years and will continue to be eligible for various services until the next BPL survey is done 10, 15 years later. Right? Now, what we find is that if we have 3 waves of IHDS, between wave 1 and 2, if I looked at the people who are poor at wave 2 and see what was their economic status before, 40% of the people were not poor before. And so they wouldn't have been eligible for the BPL benefits if we had gone by their first wave conditions. What's more, as we move towards the third wave, what we find is that the number of people who are newly poor is increasing much more, whereas a lot of other people are getting out of the poverty. So if you look at the currently poor people, 60% people were not poor before. Okay. Now, there is just a mind shift that needs to take place between what leads to poverty. Our traditional mind shift is around sort of accident of birth. You are born in a poor location, you are born in a poor family, you are born in a Dalit household, we are a scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and this is how your life is, and we'll give you benefits. Increasingly, what's happening is it's not the accident of birth, it's the accident of life that matters. There is a job loss, there is an accident, there is an illness, there is a drought. Okay? If those are the things which are becoming more important now, we need to rethink our safety nets, okay? With some basic benefits for everyone, but then a lot of insurance for these various catastrophes that can occur. Okay? And that is really quite a change to our way of thinking on how we might structure our social safety nets.
Adil, could this, the last point that she is making, given that you have worked in the government in some of these very important positions, could this be because our data are still sitting with various ministries and not necessarily they talk to us? So if you were to do the architecture of all this today, what would be that recommendation that you would want to make or probably lead for implementation so that we don't have this issue?
No, but this is in your household data, right? So
no, but what I'm saying is that household data is saying that, but it is because the time between the two look-ins is so long, and it could be not getting picked up.
Right. So I would make 2 comments. Right. One is, everyone's tried to make sure that the government doesn't work in silos. And if you try to merge all silos, it will be a never-ending exercise and nothing will ever happen. Because it's difficult enough to do 2 or 3. If you do more, it's impossible, right? So I think in terms of the data and in terms of actions to be taken across ministries, I think if you can identify where putting 2 pieces of data together is the most interesting, or putting 2 ministries together to solve a particular problem is most interesting, then there's a good chance that something can happen. Okay? But if you try to do for 50 years, we've been saying we need to have a common database. It'll never happen. It's just too complicated. There are too much data collection. So you have to think about what can we do that are simple connectors, as you said, or do some of it, and that alone will give you so much input. And in terms of, like, for example, there is some awareness that accidents and illnesses drive people into trouble, whether they go back in poverty or not. And that was really the whole thing behind Ayushman Bharat. Ayushman Bharat is only an insurance policy so that you don't fall into that hole and then you borrow at 30% or 40% and you never get out of it, right? So I think there is some understanding of it. It is always easiest to solve a problem if it is in one ministry. We should just accept that, right? And maybe you can get two to work together, or maybe you can get 2.5 to work together. But if you try to do something that cuts across everything, nothing much will happen. That's just the reality, and we have to work through that.
But I think one of the issues might be just that we need a mind shift in each ministry.
Correct.
In each ministry, the idea should be that, look, you are going to be dealing with areas where unforeseen things happen. Your program should be sort of addressing some of these unforeseen issues. What do we do if there is a drought? Okay, what will we do if there is a crop failure, crop insurance? Okay,
that I agree.
Setting in place logistics. For example, in COVID, we had to do a better job of logistics on getting oxygen cylinders around, right? So thinking through some of these issues around emerging issues of accidents and unforeseen circumstances is something maybe we want to do.
Just one last comment from both of you. Given that we are now at the advent of AI, right, and it's going to drive a lot of data which can be processed very quickly, etc. So far, we have discussed only about large data sets collected over a period of time. Now, because of the processing power that's available, alternate data is actually emerging as a big tool into both assessments as well as cross-checking what the main data is saying. Would you like to comment on is that a passing fad, or is that likely to emerge as probably very reliable tool coming through? More so in India because of digital public infrastructure that we have. We have transaction data, we have banking data, we have FASTag data, we have GST, GSTN, etc. That could be an increasingly important tool for us to harness the power of alternate data.
So I'll comment on the economic side and you can comment on the social side. See, on the economic side, availability of this data and the use of this data has got to increase dramatically. I think 5 years ago, the government was not looking at high frequency data to understand what is happening in the economy. And then we had to wait until GDP numbers came out to understand what happened. But today, actually, you can monitor, 50 different indicators, high frequency indicators, that are becoming more and more available, that give you a pulse for what is the economy doing now and what is it likely to do. For example, a simple one is, of course, power usage of different types. That data is completely digital and available. So you can see, is power being used more or not? Second, all data having to do with transportation in India is now becoming digital. What happened to loadings of trucks and railways? What is happening to traffic on the roads? We now know what is happening to traffic on all the highways from toll data, which we didn't have before, right? So we have that. We have all sorts of shipping data. How many containers, were loaded yesterday versus today, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think from an economic standpoint, there is a lot of data that is coming out and we have to start collecting it better. There will be some data that we can start collecting more of going forward. For example, the banking, transactions, etc., while keeping in mind privacy issues. So yes, I think it will be fundamental to looking forward because everything is digital. For example, we have incredible data on telecom usage. If an accident occurs somewhere, or you could see where things are happening, right? So all sorts of interesting data can be collected because we are becoming a digital economy. I mean, UPI data is incredible. Nobody has that kind of data.
On the social side, Sonu?
Well, I think that I would actually like to see us have turn a skeptical eye towards this exuberance, right? Because I think we could get swept up in this exuberance about all kinds of data sets and start using them without necessarily paying sufficient attention to the scientific validity behind it. Let me give you an example. Okay, for the last 5 years, economists have loved the nightlight data. Okay, the idea is that you can look at the night lights, and if you see changes in night light, you can decide that, okay, this is the area that's growing faster than others and use it as a marker of GDP. Fine. But the lights actually are a function of both the population size and the economic activity. And the population size very rarely gets taken into account in some of these things. So if you think about it, your Jorbag will have very few night lights, okay? Whereas if we go to Sarai Kale Khan, there will be plenty of lights there, okay? Doesn't make it a richer area than Jorbag, okay? So I think there is some skepticism and careful evaluation is needed. And this is where, I guess we have to balance out Adil Zainulbhai and Sonalde Desai and sort of come together with some sort of
I completely agree.
Careful.
I think many of this data that comes out has to go through a period of validation, right? Which is great. We have it. We should capture it. Now let's learn how it evolves and take some time to get it to do that. I would say, pay attention so that we can get it quickly and that you can validate it. But all new data requires validation. Otherwise, it doesn't. Otherwise you won't get it. You'll only discover it later that it actually didn't correlate to what you thought it should have correlated to.
No, having said that, I think there is a certain value to having use of alternate data in addition to the conventional data, and of course, one should apply more judgment to it. And as we get more and more of alternate data, I think it will start to become more mainstream.
But I'll just say one thing on alternate data before we end that, right? Which is there is a large amount of trading that is going on the stock market and for making certain other decisions, economic side only. Based on high frequency data. So, every time the GDP comes out, it affects the market. But now we have the ability to think about what the GDP numbers are likely to be because of the high frequency data. So the people who are putting their money where their mouth is are already using this.
Unfortunately, I have to bring it to a close. But there were a few interesting nuggets that came out of this conversation. One clearly is that we have to maintain the balance between privacy and use of data. And your counterpoint, Adil, with regard to that, while generally people have been saying that the government should consolidate all the data and it should all be one data set, but the point that you made with regard to that, let this be in silos, but let it be connected at the top so that we can improve the actionability or the decision making on that. And the third point, which I had not thought about and came through, is that data is just not for policy. Sitting in think tanks, we start to believe that data and policy and research is the only thing which makes sense. But really refreshing to hear your perspective on to say that data can actually lead directly to action, and building those tools for those decisions and actions to be taken could be very, very valuable. And lastly, the alternate data, which is increasingly becoming mainstream. India has a natural advantage because of very thriving DPI ecosystem. And if we are using it judiciously, then it will start to aid in our decision making and policy making. And with that, I'd like to close. I'd like to thank both of you. I think we had an enriching conversation. And on behalf of NCR, thank you so much.
Thanks.
You.